When you imagine the streets of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, what do you see? Stone archways bathed in golden light, robed figures moving quietly through sacred silence. A city that feels clean, ordered, reverent, something from a painting or a film set. Strip that image away. First-century Jerusalem was not a sanctuary. It was a collision. A living mass of bodies pressed into alleyways barely wide enough for two men to pass shoulder to shoulder. Donkeys braying, camels groaning under their loads. The shouts of merchants in 3 languages layered over one another until individual words became indistinguishable from the roar. The smell hit you first. Manure everywhere. Tracked into doorways, ground into the limestone under 10,000 sandals. Urine pooling in corners, rotting vegetable scraps, the sour tang of sweat in wool that hadn't been washed in weeks. And the dust, a fine, relentless powder that rose with every step, settled into your hair, coated your teeth, turned your throat dry before you'd walked 100 paces. During festivals, the population swelled from 40,000 to over 100,000. Pilgrims sleeping on rooftops. Families camped outside the walls. The streets became impassable. This was not the Jerusalem of sacred art. This was the Jerusalem of survival. Crowded, filthy, loud, and utterly, suffocatingly human. The streets of Jerusalem were never built for the crowds they carried. Most were less than 10 feet wide. Many were far narrower, tight corridors between limestone houses that rose 2 or 3 stories, blocking out the sun for most of the day. 2 donkeys could barely pass each other without their loads scraping the walls. Now imagine 100 donkeys, 1,000 people, all trying to move through the same constricted arteries at the same time. This was daily life. The city's permanent population hovered around 40,000. But Jerusalem was never just its residents. It was a pilgrimage city. 3 times a year, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Jews from across the Roman world converged on it. The population doubled, sometimes tripled. Over 100,000 people crammed into a space barely adequate for half that number. The main routes became gridlocked. The street leading up to the Temple Mount was especially brutal, an uphill press of pilgrims carrying lambs, lugging bundles, dragging children. You couldn't move at your own pace. You moved with the herd, or not at all. Locals knew the back routes, the thin passages between buildings, the shortcuts that required you to duck, to turn sideways, to know exactly where the step dropped off in the dark. But even those filled up. There was no traffic management, no order. If a merchant's cart broke down, the entire lane stopped. If 2 men got into an argument, everyone behind them waited. If a donkey decided to stop and relieve itself, and they did, constantly, you stood there until it finished. Movement was negotiation. Every step required spatial awareness. You brushed against strangers. You smelled their breath. You felt their sweat. Personal space did not exist. The animals were not incidental to Jerusalem's streets. They were the infrastructure. Donkeys carried water. Camels hauled goods from distant trade routes. Goats provided milk, sold door to door by herders who drove their flocks through residential quarters twice a day. Sheep moved in bleating rivers toward the temple, where thousands would be slaughtered during festival weeks. They were everywhere, and they left evidence of their presence with every step. Manure covered the streets in a thin, perpetual carpet. Fresh piles steamed in the cool morning air. Dried deposits from days prior crumbled underfoot, turning to powder that mixed with the dust. The limestone paving stones, where they existed, were stained dark brown in the channels where waste collected and ran downhill during rains. No one cleaned it. There was no sanitation department, no public works crew assigned to scrape the streets. The dung simply accumulated until rain washed some of it toward the valleys, or until it dried and blew away, or until feet compressed it into a packed layer that became part of the street itself. Children played in it. There was nowhere else to play. The narrow streets were their courtyards, their open space. They stepped over it without thinking, sat near it, touched it inadvertently a dozen times a day. Merchants set their goods down beside it. Bread sellers stacked their flatbread on wooden boards placed directly on the ground, the same ground where a donkey had relieved itself an hour earlier. Vegetables sat in baskets whose bottoms rested in the filth. People tracked it indoors, into homes, into the temple courts, where pilgrims arrived with sandals caked in the evidence of their journey through the city. The smell was omnipresent, but smell is a sense that fatigues. After days, weeks, years of exposure, the brain stops registering it as remarkable. Residents didn't notice anymore, but visitors did. Pilgrims from rural Galilee, from the clean air of the highlands, from small villages where animal waste was managed and contained, they noticed immediately. Jerusalem smelled like a barn that had never been mucked out, a barn where 100 animals lived and ate and defecated and died, all in the same space where you were trying to buy your dinner. There was no sewer system, no underground channels to carry waste away from where people lived, no flowing water to rinse the streets, no public latrines connected to anything that would remove what was deposited there. Human waste went into chamber pots, clay vessels kept under beds, in corners, used during the night or when leaving the house wasn't practical. When full, they had to go somewhere. Sometimes they were emptied into courtyards, small enclosed spaces behind or between houses where the contents would eventually dry and break down. Sometimes they were carried to designated dumping areas outside the city walls. Often they were simply thrown into the street. Upper-story residents had a particularly efficient method. Open the window, pour, let gravity do the work. There was no warning system. If you were walking below when someone decided to empty their pot, you learned to stay alert, to listen for shutters opening above, to walk quickly past windows. The Kidron Valley, just east of the city walls, became Jerusalem's primary waste repository. Refuse of every kind accumulated there. Human excrement, animal carcasses, broken pottery, rotting food. Anything the city no longer wanted rolled downhill and ended up in the Kidron. In summer, the heat intensified everything. The sun baked the waste. The smell rose and drifted back over the city walls, a constant reminder of what lay just beyond the eastern edge of town. Rain brought temporary relief and temporary disaster. Winter, storms washed some of the accumulation away, downstream toward the Dead Sea, but they also turned the streets into channels of liquefied filth, carrying everything that had been deposited there during the dry months directly past doorways and into lower-lying homes. There were public latrines, stone benches with holes positioned over pits or trenches. shared facilities where a dozen men might sit side by side, conducting business and conversation simultaneously. Privacy was not part of the design. These latrines filled. Eventually, they had to be emptied. This was work assigned to the lowest social classes, men who made their living shoveling human waste into containers and hauling it outside the walls. The smell clung to them. It marked them. Everyone knew what they did for a living before they spoke a word. Ritual purity laws meant constant hand-washing for those who could afford it. Not because people understood bacteria or disease transmission. They didn't. But because the law required cleanness, and in a city like this, you were contaminated 10 times before midday just by walking to the market. The wealthy could maintain some distance from the worst of it. Larger homes, private courtyards, servants to handle the chamber pots, higher quality water sources. The poor had none of these buffers. They lived in the stench, breathed it, wore it on their clothes, raised their children in it. The noise never stopped. From first light until well after dark, Jerusalem was a layered assault of sound. Voices overlapped in at least 3 languages: Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, sometimes 4 or 5, when merchants from Egypt, Rome, or Mesopotamia set up their stalls. Merchants didn't wait for customers to approach. They shouted, competed, called out prices, descriptions, promises. A vegetable seller's voice overlapped with a fabric merchant's, both trying to drown out the man selling pottery just 5 paces away. Dates from Jericho, sweeter than honey, finest linen, touch it and see. Oil lamps, no home should be without light. The animal sounds wove through everything. Donkeys brayed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through conversation. Goats bleated constantly, especially when being led to slaughter or separated from their young. Camels groaned and gurgled, their complaints as unpleasant as their smell. Sheep contributed a lower, rhythmic bleating that became white noise during festival seasons when thousands moved through the streets toward the temple. Metal clanged from workshops tucked into ground floor rooms. Blacksmiths hammering iron, coppersmiths shaping pots. The repetitive ring of hammer on anvil echoed off stone walls, amplified by the narrow passages. Arguments erupted without warning. A customer accused a merchant of using false weights. 2 men disputed a boundary. A woman shouted at children who'd knocked over her basket. Voices rose, sharp and angry, until someone intervened or both parties exhausted themselves. Religious chanters added another layer, men proclaiming scripture, prophets warning of judgment, teachers with students clustered around them, repeating phrases in unison for memorization. During festivals, pilgrims sang psalms as they ascended toward the temple, their voices blending into a wall of sound that pressed against everyone nearby. Wheels creaked over stone. Wood scraped against wood as carts were loaded and unloaded. Pottery shattered when someone's bundle shifted. Children cried. Women called to neighbors from upper windows. Dogs barked at strangers, at other dogs, at nothing. There was no escape from it. Stone walls reflected sound instead of absorbing it. Every noise bounced, doubled, came at you from multiple directions. A shout from 50 paces away sounded like it came from just behind you. Silence was not part of urban existence. Your ears never rested. Even at night, the city only quieted. It never went truly silent. Someone was always moving, working, talking, arguing. For those who lived there, the noise became something you learned to function within. You trained yourself to focus, to filter, to hear the voice you needed while the chaos continued around you. For visitors, it was overwhelming. A sensory assault that made rest impossible, concentration difficult, peace unattainable. This was the sound of Jerusalem. Not sacred, not reverent, just relentlessly, exhaustingly human. The markets were not enclosed buildings. They were open air, exposed to sun, dust, flies, and everything the streets carried with them. Meat hung from hooks on wooden frames, lamb, goat, occasionally beef. The cuts swayed slightly when someone brushed past, their surfaces darkening as the day wore on and flies settled in waves. There was no refrigeration, no ice, no way to preserve freshness except to sell quickly. Butchers worked in full view. They slaughtered animals in small courtyards or directly at their stalls, blood running into channels cut in the stone or simply pooling until it soaked into the ground. The smell was immediate, iron and viscera, mixed with the acrid tang of internal organs exposed to air. Fish came up from Galilee, a 2 or 3 day journey even in good conditions. By the time they reached Jerusalem's markets, they were barely holding together. Vendors packed them in salt, but it only slowed decay. It didn't stop it. The stench announced the fish section long before you saw it. People haggled next to carcasses. Children darted between stalls where entrails were being scraped into waste buckets. Women inspected vegetables while standing in proximity to meat that had been sitting since dawn. Flies were constant. They moved between the animal dung in the street, the rotting scraps in the corners, and the food being sold. No one tried to stop them. There were too many. Vendors waved their hands periodically to disperse a cluster, but they returned within seconds. Pottery shards crunched underfoot, broken containers, discarded and never cleared. Vegetable trimmings, trampled and browning, mixed with the debris. The ground was uneven, slick in some places from spilled liquids no one had bothered to identify. Blood, water, oil, wine, all of it ended up on the same stone surface where people walked. The sensory assault was total. Sight, sound, smell, even touch. Your sandals stuck slightly with each step, and you felt the grit of the street through the thin leather. This wasn't a place you lingered. You came, you purchased what you needed, you left. Shopping was not leisure. It was exposure. The dust was not occasional. It was structural. Jerusalem sat on limestone terrain. Pale, porous stone that fractured easily under pressure. Every footstep ground tiny particles loose. Every hoof strike released more. Cartwheels crushed it finer. By midday, the air in the streets hung thick with suspended powder. During dry months, late spring through early autumn, the dust became the dominant fact of outdoor life. It rose in visible clouds when crowds passed. It settled on clothing, turning dark fabric pale within an hour. It coated exposed skin, mixing with sweat to form a gritty paste in the creases of your neck, behind your ears, between your fingers. Food was never free of it. Bread bakers worked in open courtyards. The dough, kneaded and shaped outdoors, collected a fine layer before it even reached the oven. Vegetables in the market sat uncovered. Dried fish, already coated in salt, gained a second coating of limestone powder. You tasted it in every meal. Water containers offered no protection. Ceramic jars, carried from public fountains or private cisterns, were covered with cloth, but cloth was porous. By the time you poured a cup, sediment swirled at the bottom. You learned to drink from the top and leave the last portion untouched. The dust infiltrated homes. Window openings had no glass, only wooden shutters that let air through, even when closed. Doorways, covered by hanging fabric, couldn't seal completely. The powder drifted in, settled on sleeping mats, on cooking surfaces, on everything stored at ground level. It invaded your body, your lungs. Every breath in the streets carried particles too fine to see, but substantial enough to irritate. Chronic coughing was common. Respiratory ailments appeared in skeletal remains archaeologists have examined. Inflammation markers, lung damage consistent with years of inhaling abrasive material. Children suffered worst. Smaller bodies, faster breathing rates, more time playing in the streets where the dust was thickest. Their developing lungs bore the accumulating damage with no understanding of what was happening or why breathing sometimes hurt. There was no relief except rain, and rain came infrequently. Jerusalem's climate offered a wet season and a dry season, with months between meaningful precipitation. When storms finally arrived, they turned the dust to mud, which created its own problems. But for a few days after, the air cleared. You could breathe deeply without coughing. Food tasted like itself again instead of grit and stone. Then the sun returned, the streets dried, and the dust rose again, as it always had, as it always would. 3 times each year the city became unrecognizable. Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, festivals that brought every available Jew within traveling distance. Men were required to appear. Families came when they could afford it. The roads leading into Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims weeks before each celebration began. The population didn't just increase, it exploded. Streets that barely functioned at 40,000 inhabitants now held double that. Triple during Passover. Over 100,000 people compressed into a space with no capacity to absorb them. Housing didn't exist for these numbers. Inns filled immediately, then began charging rates only the wealthy could manage. Everyone else improvised. Rooftops became sleeping quarters. Families spread mats on flat surfaces and slept under open sky. Alleyways turned into campsites. Courtyards hosted strangers who paid homeowners for the privilege of lying on stone for a few nights. Outside the walls, tent cities materialized. Thousands camped in the valleys, on hillsides, anywhere relatively flat. The Kidron Valley, already the city's waste dump, now doubled as overflow housing. Hygiene collapsed under the surge. Human waste overwhelmed the city's already inadequate systems. Chamber pots filled faster than they could be emptied. Public latrines became unusable, their pits overflowing. The streets absorbed what couldn't go anywhere else. The smell intensified beyond what even residents considered normal. Temporary markets erupted to feed the masses. Vendors who never operated during regular months suddenly appeared, selling at inflated prices to captive customers. More animals poured in. Sheep, especially, driven in bleating thousands toward the temple for sacrifice. Disease moved through the crowds invisibly. Respiratory infections spread in the compressed sleeping quarters. Contaminated water sickened pilgrims, unfamiliar with which sources were safest. Fever broke out in clusters, and there was nowhere to isolate the ill. For locals, festival seasons meant survival mode. Stay inside when possible. Avoid main routes entirely. Stock provisions before the surge hit, so you wouldn't need to fight through the pilgrim masses for basic supplies. The city they knew disappeared under the weight of religious obligation, and it would remain that way, loud, filthy, disease-ridden, barely navigable, until the festival ended and the crowds finally drained away. This wasn't backdrop, it was context. When Jesus touched a leper, he didn't reach across a sanitized space. He pushed through streets already thick with filth toward someone living in conditions that differed from the norm only by degree. When he ate with tax collectors and sinners, the scandal wasn't abstract. It was physical, sharing food that carried the dust of Roman collaboration in rooms that smelled like every other room in the city. The kingdom he preached wasn't philosophy debated in clean halls. It was hope spoken into air you could taste, to people whose bodies carried the evidence of where they'd been and what they'd endured. This was Jerusalem, not sacred stone glowing in golden light, a city that reeked of sweat, manure, and survival. Next time, we'll look at what people actually ate in this world and why hunger was never far away. If you're still here, subscribe. These stories deserve to be told as they were.
Only 3 denarii for the basket.
3.